Welcome to Democracy Nerd. I am Jeff Smith. Let's say you're a loyal listener, if I can not overuse the term, of the Democracy Nerd podcast. You listen to new episodes when they're released. You can also go to the website, democracynerd.us, to get caught up on previous episodes. You can listen to policy issues discussed about the backsliding of American democracy, how we might reclaim it, from some of the smartest authors and activists on the topic. Also, the targeting of marginalized people to win votes, how money corrupts the political system, and you might think, well, I could do a much better job if I were in office. I don't mean me, I mean you. If this sounds familiar to you, our guest today has a message. Do it. No, our guest today isn't the Just Do It Nike founder who believes, well, I won't make comments on his political views at this point, but our guest today is Amanda Litman, co-founder and co-director of Run for Something, an organization that recruits progressive candidates to run for office. Amanda Litman, a legend. Welcome to Democracy Nerd, and thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Let's get into your background a little bit. You helped start Run for Something in 2017. Before that, you worked on campaigns for the 2016 presidential campaign and digital strategy. Tell your own story.
So I was born and raised in Northern Virginia, went to Northwestern for college right outside Chicago. My senior year, I got an internship on the Obama campaign's reelect. I'd always wanted to work in politics. It was the only thing I ever really knew I wanted to do. I wasn't quite sure if I wanted to do it as a journalist or as a campaign operative. But by the time I hit my senior year of college, I knew I wanted to do campaigns. And in particular, I wanted to work for President Barack Obama. I got a job writing online fundraising emails, asking people for money, saying, hey, do you want to have dinner with Barack Obama? Enter here. Was hired before I graduated. Kept that through election day, which we won. So fun. Stayed working for the president's nonprofit, Organizing for Action, for about a year. Moved down to Florida in 2014 and worked for Charlie Crist's campaign for governor back then. We lost, which was terrible, but I did go to Disney World. So, at least that was fine. And then I moved up to New York in 2016, early 2015, to work for Secretary Clinton's presidential campaign. And I was her email director doing online fundraising and volunteer recruitment. It was the best, hardest, worst, hopefully one of the most meaningful things I'll ever do.
So you worked on campaigns. At some point, you got interested in politics. I'd be interested in hearing your story about how you got interested in politics in the first place. And then we can move to talking about how you started the organization.
I don't remember a time I wasn't interested in politics, which is kind of a boring answer here. I was just one of those nerds who always read the paper over breakfast with my parents as a, middle schooler, high schooler. I volunteered on campaigns. I volunteered for NARAL Pro-Choice Virginia, which when I was growing up in the 90s and early 2000s in Virginia, that was a very controversial organization, controversial issue to take on. Still is, unfortunately. This is just the only thing I ever knew I wanted to do. I wanted to make the world a better place, and politics made sense to me as a way to do it.
So after you work on the Crist campaign, after you work on the Obama campaign, after you work on the Hillary Clinton campaign, you start Run for Something. Tell us the origin story.
So about a week after Election Day in 2016, I am personally and professionally crushed. I get a Facebook message from somebody I'd gone to college with. Hey, Amanda, I'm a public school teacher in Chicago. I'm thinking about running for office. You're the only person I know that's worked in campaigns. What do I do? Who do I call? How do I do this? And I didn't have an answer for them because at the time, if you were young, if you were newly excited about campaigns and you wanted to do more than vote and more than volunteer, there was nowhere you could go that would take your call. And that, to me, felt like a symptom of really big problems, not just in our party, but in our democracy. So I reached out to a whole bunch of people with an idea. What if we created an organization kind of like Emily's List, but a little bit different, specifically focused on young people, local office, first-time candidates, but had the same goal of making young people, especially women, people of color, LGBTQIA folks, seen as viable candidates. One of those folks, Ross Morales Riquetto, became my co-founder, and we wrote a plan and we built a website, and then we launched Run for Something on Trump's inauguration day in 2017, thinking it'd be really small. We'd get 100 people who want to run in the first year. Excellent. Instead, nearly 1,000 people signed up in the first week, and it is so much more than just a hobby, which is such a gift.
I don't want to call it catastrophic success, but that is a thing that can happen. So this
Mhm.
ends up being, it starts out being something you think is going to be maybe avocation, a cool project, and it ends up, I assume, consuming you. How much of your life did it become? I'm guessing the biggest pursuit of yours.
It is the I often joke, my dog is my first baby, Run for Something is my second, and then the baby I had earlier this year is my third. It is my whole being. It's everything. I mean, it is now a 50 some odd person staffed organization, close
How
to
many people?
more than 50, and we're
Wow.
growing ever more. Although up until this year it was about 20 people, which is wild. We had done so much with such a small, scrappy team. Uh, Nearly $17 million budget this year, along with things like a book and a podcast and events and holidays. And hopefully already more than 800 elected officials across the country who name themselves as part of our alumni community.
So what do you give your participants? Whether it was those first 100, those first 1,000, or now some of those 800, what sort of resources do they get? They get encouragement, of course. What else?
So I think about this like a marketing funnel, which is I think the most sort of comparable experience. About 130,000 young people have signed up on our website to say, I'm thinking about running for office. They've gone to runforwhat.net, they've entered their information, they've told us, yeah, I am open to this as an opportunity. Tell me more. Smaller number of them have joined a conference call where we answer the basic questions every first-time candidate has. Throughout this, we're continuing to send content and material to potential candidates in the 130,000 person pipeline about how to run, what to do, how to get on the ballot, events that we've got coming up they can learn more, candidates that they can engage with, that kind of thing. A smaller number than that actually filed to get on the ballot. We have found about 10% of the people who sign up with us at any given point are running for office, which is a pretty comparable benchmark across other organizations. A smaller number than that still apply for the Run for Something endorsement. Our endorsement application is entirely public. We want to see your campaign plan, your budget, your win number, how you're going to get from A to Z, what we're going to find when we do a background check. We want you to align with some basic Run for Something values. We want to know how those values show up in your campaign. And we want to know your plan for knocking doors and talking to voters in whatever way makes sense for your race. Endorsement applications are reviewed by 3 different sets of folks, including state leads who give us on-the-ground intel, a vetting firm that does a background check to make sure that you're being honest with us, and then someone on our staff, which reviews every application. We endorse a little less than half the people who apply. We've now endorsed more than 2,200 folks across the lifetime of the organization, across all 50 states, mostly women, mostly people of color, and about a quarter LGBTQIA+. Once you're endorsed, you work directly with our regional or state director in your community. And they will be 1 part coach, 1 part consultant, 1 part therapist. If we're legally able to raise money for you in your state, we'll help you with that. Same with volunteers. We have a network of about 500 mentors across the country who will help you with whatever it is you need from your campaign. We will get you press, we'll put you on social, we'll amplify you to partners looking to make endorsements. If you say you need your field director to get trained on how to use the voter file, we'll get the training. If you say you need access to the voter file, we'll get access to that. If you don't know what the voter file is, because you've never been in politics before, we will explain that to you. So we are here for you, soup to nuts, all the way through Election Day.
What are you proudest of at this point?
Oh, I am so proud of the work that we have done to bring especially young women into office, especially young new moms into office. I think it is so incredibly important to have people who intimately and personally understand how, especially some of the most important issues right now around reproductive rights, around childcare, around public schools, around housing, for them it's personal. And I think it's really, really important to have their voices in leadership, which is not to say that I'm not also so proud of the more than 800 folks we've now elected. I think it's unbelievable and it's beyond my wildest dreams. I'm also really proud that we've built an organization internally that treats people like real people. I'm really proud of who we are as an employer. I'm proud of the culture that we've built and the way that we have tried to model that for the rest of the political ecosystem.
What's the hardest part?
Fundraising.
Yeah. Let's go into that. What's the fund to raise $17 million, right? You're not doing that from one source. I assume the Koch brothers aren't part of the, sort of part of your capital stack. How do you approach it? How do you set the budget at the beginning of the year and how do you go about finding it?
Well, our budget has grown exponentially in the last 6 years. For context, last year our budget was about 6 million. This year it is much, much more, obviously. That's because we raised a lot last year. We were able to build a comfortable cushion going into this year. Part of that was through our work on a program we called Clerk Work, which is specifically around recruiting and supporting people to run for local election administrator roles, often called city or county clerks, hence the name of the program. And this is an urgent problem we need to do to save democracy. The far right, especially Steve Bannon and the like, were really investing a lot of energy and resources into taking over the kinds of positions that if they win, they can undermine democracy from the ground up. So we wanted to make sure that wasn't going to happen. But I also think after being around for 6 years now, we have built relationships with funders big and small. We have more than 30,000 individual donors to run for something, which I'm so proud of. We have people who give as small as $1 and as much as many, many more than that. And I'm so grateful for every last one of them. And this is work that's hard to invest in, because at first glance you're like, yeah, that's great, but that's not the biggest problem we have to solve. And I would argue that if we don't solve this, if we do not win local offices, if we do not win the tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of small elections, it will be so much harder for us to win the big ones.
And so when you say people's reaction is this isn't the biggest problem, because in their mind, the biggest problem is, for instance, what you were working on in 2016. They're thinking, well, if this isn't Donald Trump's election, this isn't the most important thing. And you're like, well, what about this county clerk's race? What about these 22 county clerk's race? And they're like, I don't even know what a county clerk is. But I see Donald Trump on my cable TV and on my Twitter feed every single day. Am I gathering that right?
Yeah, this isn't the flashy, sexy thing that makes headlines, although I certainly try to make headlines. But it's not flashy, it's not exciting. It doesn't get you invited to fancy cocktail parties, doesn't get you to become an ambassador, but it is the building blocks of democracy. And wow, is the other side investing in it, which even if you don't buy into, you don't drink my Kool-Aid about the need to build a long-term power, if you aren't excited about discovering new talent in the Democratic Party, and you aren't pumped about winning school board races, like the fact that the Republican Party has an entire ecosystem set up to invest in and engage in these local races, and has for decades, should be enough to tell you that it's worth doing.
Explain, when you say the other side, when you say the Republican apparatus has been investing in that, help map that landscape for us. What does that look like?
Yeah, two good examples here. There's an organization called the Leadership Institute. It's a mostly Koch brothers funded entity. They do training and recruitment for young operatives and activists. Basically every young operative and activist you don't like, or maybe you do, I don't know. But every young conservative operative and activist has come through their pipeline over the last now 30 some odd years. Their annual budget has hovered around 30 million as of last public filings, and has for quite a while. They are currently running a program where they are doing school board candidate trainings. Ted Cruz did a curriculum for them for their school board candidates. Their school board program is run by this woman, Bridget Ziegler. She is also the co-founder of this organization called Moms for Liberty, which you may have seen in the news a bunch lately, about the group leading some of the book bans and anti-LGBTQ work in schools. She was previously, and I think is currently, a school board member. Her husband is the vice chairman of the Republican Party. The other piece of this ecosystem includes Americans for Prosperity, also a Koch brothers funded entity. It basically has state-based chapters in dozens of states, if not all of them, doing year-round organizing work, especially around local races. Those are just two tiny pieces of the big, big pie.
We're allowed to get deep, right? If you want to name more pieces, and I do want to get more into the county clerks thing. I do want to get more into fundraising, and now I do want to get into sort of the apparatus, because to me, this is the sexy stuff. To me, it is the thing that's getting missed by major media, right? Major media will delve into and fixate on it. We're something else I want to get into. A friend of mine just resigned today as Secretary of State of Oregon, and they will get into a mistake that a candidate or an elected official makes. And that makes headline news for days, but the slow build of the kind of power apparatus that ends up running the whole country, that 8 secretaries of state aren't as important as that apparatus, that ends up being, I think, almost off the radar screen of even the most famous and well-paid pundits in the country. That if you asked them, they wouldn't know what was going on. And so they're not in the position. So the New York Times is in a position to insert information in their stories because they don't know about it enough. They don't connect all these dots. Like when you say Leadership Institute, I think that alumni, even if people haven't heard of that organization, people will have heard of their alumni, which I believe does include like maybe Mitch McConnell. I think maybe James O'Keefe. I mean Grover Norquist and Ralph Reed. It goes back a while, right? But you would know. I don't want to misquote it. You would know better than I in terms of alumni, in terms of helping people understand the influence of that apparatus and the impact that it makes, the impact that it can make.
I mean, I think you nailed it on the head. There is, I think, this understanding, because we have more or less a national media landscape at this point, that there is a singular national election. That is fundamentally and like quite literally not true. We have 50 state elections that are then broken up into thousands of county elections, and then are often administered on the local level. For example, in Michigan, there are more than 1,400 offices that touch election administration. In Wisconsin, it's done on the municipal level. In New Hampshire, it's done on the municipal level. In some states, there are offices like tax assessor or probate judge, or even sheriff, that touch in some way, shape, or form election administration, which means in many ways it's harder to hack, and it is so much easier to undermine in a small way. We have seen proof of how this will work, for example, in Cochise. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it right. I admit I've only ever read it, but Cochise County in Arizona, where the county board of supervisors has decided that they don't believe in the validity of the 2020 election, and they have done things like try and turn it over to hand counting. They refuse to certify. They have been sued. They have been pushed by the state, and they just hired a new election administrator to literally run the election in this county. And this is a place that Republicans win, more or less, who doesn't believe in the legitimacy of the 2020 election. This is going to come into play in 2024 when there's a Senate race there, when there is a presidential race there, not the least of which is all the other offices that these positions touch. All of this is to say that the Republican ecosystem, which includes both official entities like the Republican Party, the National Committee, state parties, the Leadership Institute, Americans for Prosperity, as well as the more like outside the party ecosystem, like Steve Bannon, who goes on his podcast and calls for people to run for office, as well as QAnon, which on the lead forum for QAnoners for a while was a call: run for city council, run for school board, run for local office. They understand that these positions build power. And the thing that I know really like alarms me and that keeps me up at night in particular, there is a quote from Ralph Reed, who you named earlier as one of the leaders of the far right Christian moral majority, who said, "I would rather have 1,000 school board members than one president." They get this, they understand this, and they fund it and invest in it accordingly. Democrats have made so much progress, and I don't want to diminish that. We've made so much progress in the last 6 years towards winning and engaging in these races. And it is going to be very tempting going into another Trump election, likely, to let our foot off the gas and refocus our efforts on the presidency. That is a mistake. Winning the presidency is important. It is also not sufficient. We have to do it all. Rant over.
No, it's great. It's helpful. And for people to understand, because it is the shiniest object can glare our eyes away from other objects. And if we want to understand democracy, we're willing to be democracy nerds. We're willing to try to get deep. Then almost by definition, right, we want to look beyond presidential races. And a thing that we used to talk about was reverse coattails. The good news is if you show up to vote for a school board race, you're going to vote for president. Right? Like you're not gonna skip over that race. If you show up to vote for a state legislative race, you're gonna vote for the congressional candidate also, right? But if somebody shows up just because they think they're supposed to vote for president, some number might think their job is done after they've gone down the page a ways, right? That focusing on local elections, and I will say whether as you are a big D Democratic activist, or whether somebody's working on exclusively nonpartisan races, or trying to reclaim a Republican Party that people can be proud of, that focus I think is both strategic and and moral, right? And a smart application of energy and resource. So I applaud you for it. And to pile on, Grover Norquist said a similar thing about Congress. Said this town, talking about Washington, D.C., doesn't run based on who's president. It runs based on who's Congress. Now let's think about Congress gets elected. Congress doesn't get just elected because people donate to congressional campaigns. They get elected based on the districts that are drawn, and who draws those? Those are drawn by state legislative races, right? So the stuff that people care about most, we end up looking at the lagging indicators, and we got to be looking at the leading indicators as well. So I'm maybe just stealing on your rant. Feel free to push back or amplify before I move on.
No, I think that's exactly right. You think about the offices that control the levers of power and the structures of power. The presidency doesn't really determine how elections are run or who gets to vote. He certainly gets a say in pushing the bully pulpit, but state legislature, city council, school boards, library boards, county government, all of that, and the nearly 500,000 elected offices in the United States, they're not the presidency. That's what really matters when you think about what makes people's lives better and what makes our democracy function.
You went back and talked about, I want to go back to something you brought up, which was fundraising. I said, what's the hardest part? You said fundraising. You raised $17 million, up from $6 million previously. Some of that was because your county clerk's program. I assume we had the poster child for people needing to care more about county clerk elections was in Oregon, Sherry Hall in Clackamas County. I and now kind of maybe assume that Catherine McMullen, who is the replacement, I wouldn't be surprised at all if she were a run for something alum. But as you think about that fundraiser, you got 30,000 individual donors, most of that online. How much of your time are you spending doing meetings? Let's dig into that, because I do want people to understand, as part of this thing, and I've got to bring it up because it's on my mind and I care about her, and she's she's a good Secretary of State, and she's a good friend, and so I'm a little bit in my feels about it. But a friend of mine, Secretary of State, resigned literally today. Literally, I found out an hour ago, and part of the is because she had a contract with a cannabis firm to help them build business outside the state, and they ended up being and they ended up having their own sort of dirty deals. And it's come back on her, and she's resigned. What has been part of the story, but isn't the headline of the story, is we pay our Secretary of State $77,000 a year, and she's a single mom of 2 kids with a bunch of debt. And meanwhile, who she was signed the contract with was, we're talking about $20,000 she ended up getting, right? Yeah. And they were major donors, and in order to compete. In order to compete to win, Tina Kotek, Oregon governor, just raised, I think it was $70 million. Right? It used to be, if you ran for office, it was the cost of a family car. Then it became the cost of an affordable house. Then it became the cost of a mansion. Now, to run for governor of a state, it's the cost of a Larry Ellison private island. Right? It's out of reach for most human beings. And so there is a story that people can consume and understand. Okay, existing candidate, existing person does something wrong, either way back in their life or right now, and deals with public trust in a way that people aren't comfortable with, or in a way that's just flat wrong. And that's an easy story to understand, but harder to understand, or at least I think we have a greater burden, a greater duty to help people understand this context. She wasn't doing it for 20 grand. She was doing it because she also wanted to make friends with somebody who's becoming a major donor, so she could be in a better position to raise $70 million in the future, because we don't have publicly financed elections. And in this state, we don't have campaign finance limits. So it makes it on my mind that when we think about work like yours, I do want people to understand the context in which it operates, like what it actually takes to be Amanda Litman and wake up every day and figure out how to get 50 people fed, 50 people with benefits, right? I've started organizations before, and I haven't been proud of what we've been in a position to pay. I haven't been proud of how well we've been able to treat folks, because we haven't had any money, right? And so I am, it hits personally in a couple layers, right? And I deeply admire the work that you've done, and the work that you are doing, and understanding the architecture of that. Therefore, has curiosity that I'm personally interested in, but I also think there's something riding on it, right? I think people being willing to dig into that, how that actually works, because they connect those dots, and that helps even journalists get the stories a little bit better, a little bit smarter, and a little bit more than just the headline, a little bit better on the context. So let's walk through a little bit more. How much of your day, how much of your week is spent on that? You've presumably got a development director and maybe a team that does it. Presumably do some digital fundraising as well as individual fundraising, maybe grant writing. Keep walking us through if you're willing.
So our development team, up until about 6 weeks ago, maybe 8 weeks ago, was a VP of development and 2 associates, or like 2 junior folks of varying levels. Plus we have an excellent fundraising consultant. My co-founder and I would argue that 100% of our time is spent, if not actively asking for money, thinking about asking for money, laying the groundwork to ask for money, making sure that the work we're doing, we have the results back to use it to return for asking for money. And that's okay. That's our jobs. Part of the reason that we spend our time doing that is so that we can make sure we pay our staff well, that we give good benefits, that we can employ people for as long as humanly possible, so that we don't have to expand and contract with the election cycle. I do think you get at something really important. I don't know the details of the Oregon Secretary of State the way that you do,
Sure.
but you do get at something really important about the structure in which these candidates and elected officials are working in. Most elected officials are paid nothing or barely paid. Most elected positions are not full-time. Most of our candidates have to work a 9 to 5 and then campaign a 5 to midnight, 5 to 2 a.m., whatever it may be, on top of the rest of their lives. I'm really lucky. And I'm really privileged. I'm really grateful that the first year that Run for Something existed, I was able to write a book, which paid my rent. Thank God for that. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here. Like, Run for Something would not exist if that had not happened, because I was unemployed. And I think it's like, that is a privilege, and also a chance of luck and skill and all of the things that layer on top of that. But there have been many points over the last 6 years where we thought, if we don't get in this final check, or the recurring numbers change, like, we'll have to close our doors. And that's really scary. It's why I take so seriously the culture of gratitude that we've tried to build. And I genuinely feel it. Like, I meet people who will be like, oh, I'm a recurring donor. Oh, like, I gave you guys some money. It's like, that means the world to me. That means the world to me. Like, what a gift and what a privilege to be worthy of someone's financial investment.
And part of it, and I appreciate you so much telling your story about how you're able to make it possible, because how it starts, like how the initial funding happens, is a big part of it, right?
Yeah.
And if you're and does that happen because you're Naders Raiders and you recruit people with some privilege so they're able to take a year off, and then later you get criticized, well, wait a minute, why do you have so many white kids, why do you have so many privileged kids? And so these are the kids who are able to be essentially monks for democracy.
Yeah.
Right? If you in your case, the story of the book is such a great story, and it's one of the reasons it reminds me a little bit of the conversation I had with the head of Patriotic Millionaires on this series of discussions in this podcast. That essentially what I do when I have the chance is urge people to put pro-democracy stuff in their will, right?
Yeah.
Is to consider it a major piece of their contribution to the world, right? Not a thing you offer just a few pennies to, but something that you can provide infrastructural, like meaningful support. So the next Amanda Litman, so the next generation of candidates, so the next generation of activists has a chance to build upon something, and not only relying on their own family's privilege, which provides its own then filter on who has a chance to do it, but so the kind of resources that make a democracy function. Feel free to plug anything you want. We'll move from fundraising, but feel free to, pile on or plug.
Well, I should say, if you're listening to this and you're like, man, Run for Something sounds great, runforsomething.net/donate is where you go. Anytime I meet someone who works in a big tech job, or especially, I'm like, your recurring donation is always welcome. We really do. We are so grateful to our funders, because this is a long shot in every sense of the word. And the fact that we are still here 6.5 years in is because of the people who believed in it. And I am grateful for them.
So in your too long don't read summary of your messaging chapter, moving to your book a little, moving a little bit to content, I want to get into some of the stuff you teach and some of the stuff you do and help people do. I should ask, you've helped multiple candidates. Have you run for office before?
No, I've worked on campaigns, but no.
All right. But you do give a real talk guide through your own firsthand observation and observations of sort of what works, what doesn't work. On messaging, something I enjoyed is on your messaging chapter, you advise not to be an asshole. And your words, not mine. Say more about that. It seems like being an asshole has some appeal to some voters. There is power in assholery, it seems. Maybe not, but it seems. Make your case.
I think that there is certainly a subset of people who get the privilege of being an asshole, but for most people, most of the time it doesn't work. And actually, what I think being an asshole is reflective of is not even that people want someone to be mean. They want someone who feels emotion. They want someone who is not a robot. They want someone who maybe hasn't been, born and bred to be an elected official, hasn't been thinking about running for office since they were in kindergarten. They want authenticity. I think this is especially true for young people who can smell the bullshit from a mile away. Just don't be a dick. And that is, I think, a big part of campaigning. It's a big part of fundraising, of working with press, of working with volunteers, of the relationships that you build as part of being a politician or a candidate. Is you gotta lead with trust. Feels really sappy to say. And you got to return to people with gratitude. Now, and when it comes to messaging as a candidate in particular, I would say speak like a real person, communicate like a real person, don't over academicize or intellectualize. That's the word I'm looking for. Don't over intellectualize things. But talk like a real person and be honest with people about who you are and what you believe and why you believe it. And even if they disagree with you, most of the time they'll be grateful that you're being on the level with them.
Even this, as I think about myself as in my late 20s and early 30s, as I was a flawed human being trying to do activism work, and then as an elected official, and then as a candidate, some of your stuff would have been so useful. You said offer some key questions, including why am I doing this? What a good and basic question, right?
Yeah.
Like, I mean, it's a good and basic question. And I remember that two conversations I had with candidates who were looking for my support. And I said, what do you want to get done when you do it? Why are you doing it? And they said, what? And they both said, well, we're still working on the policy part. We're still figuring that out. And that for me was sort of a disqualifier, right? But so why am I doing this? Another one that, and it's just, I think about it with some shame. Like, what are my strengths and weaknesses as a leader? Right? Saying that up front, being ready to talk about that up front. A third, what I'm most proud of about my life. Another basic but good question. Then why should I win this election? Like, it seems like basic questions. I'm struggling to come up with a good question other than just applause for what feels to me wisdom about the basic questions. But do you get a sense that people skip over that stuff, that they're so thinking about their votes to win number and how much money they need to raise, and maybe their ambition clouds their judgment, or they're thinking about how they're ready to respond to what somebody else says, and so there is usefulness, utility in reminding them some basic fundamental things?
I think when people come to us and are say, I want to run for office, I want to do XYZ, how do I start my campaign? We often actually, all right, let's pause. We have 3 questions for you. We have many questions for people, but we have 3 initial starter points. 1, what is the problem you care about solving, or the thing you're really excited to improve upon? Basically, like, what is the thing, the problem, the issue area, the thing that really motivates you? 2, how is the office you're running for giving you a place to solve it? Which is a really important part of not why now, but why this. And 3, why should voters want you to win? Which is very different than why do you want to win? You want to win because winning is great and losing sucks. Voters are going to want you to win because you're going to do something for them. You're going to deliver for them. And if you can answer those 3 questions, what's the problem, why this office, and why voters want you to win, basically everything else about a campaign is logistics. It's hard. Don't get me wrong. It is hard to run for office. It is crushing. It can be devastating. It is often very miserable, and it is to a T. Basically every candidate, win or lose, will say it's the best thing I've ever done. It has been absolutely worth it. But if you can answer those questions, the rest of it's not rocket science. It's talking to voters. It's figuring out how to communicate with people within a deadline while following the laws. There's some, institutional stuff. There's some relationship pieces, but none of this is complicated. You just got to know why.
Hugely helpful. I'll say them again, the 3 I heard you say, which is what's the 3 basic questions that you start with candidates. What is the problem you care about solving? How does this office relate to help you solve this problem? And 3rd, why should voters want you to win? Which is different than why do you want to win? Because, winning is great, losing sucks. Explain the importance of developing a campaign theme.
I think that answer to those 3 questions is your campaign theme, because the number 1 question you're going to get when you're knocking doors or going to forums is why are you doing this? Tell me why you're running. You know this as a candidate. It's the thing that you're going to get asked most often. Like, so who are you and why should I care? That answer, that becomes your campaign theme. The mechanics of how you communicate that theme, which parts of that theme to emphasize to which parts of your community, how to sort of like what words you use to articulate it. That is, again, that's logistics. That's not the core. And I think we have seen this on national scale. The candidates that do best, the candidates that win or that catch fire in some way, shape, or form can answer the question of why in a way that seems true and authentic to who they are. The ones who flounder is because their campaign, often these are bigger races with lots of stuff, are spent debating what we believe as opposed to how to communicate what we believe. And those are two different things.
You write that you're not just running, that the candidate is not just running against their opponent in the election. What else are they running against?
Oh man, they're running against the preconceived notions among their voters of what a politician is and what a politician looks like. They're running against a system in many ways that isn't meant for people like them. They're running against apathy. They're running against everything else that is more interesting than politics, from what's on Netflix to Love is Blind to sports to
Love is blind.
Love is Blind. They are running against the very idea that this doesn't matter, and they're trying to prove that wrong. It's hard. It's hard.
How do you even quantify how valuable it is to grab a voter's attention?
How do you quantify how valuable it is? Well, the thing that political science research has shown is that the most effective tool to get someone to show up and vote, which is your intended outcome, is a relationship between candidate and voter. And everything else, ideally face-to-face, person-to-person, everything else is about replicating the intimacy of that relationship in whatever platform or tactic makes sense. So like a text message, a TV ad, an earned media piece, a forum where it's one-to-many people. All of that is trying to recreate the intimacy of someone coming into your home and saying, hi, I'm Amanda, I'm running for city council, and I want to talk to you about property taxes. That conversation and the heart of that conversation can break through so much bullshit. And this is especially true for people running in deep red or even purple areas or blue, where they're getting attacked or harassed, where the media, such that it is, their opponent is trying to paint an image of a candidate that isn't who they are in reality. The person-to-person relationship can circumvent that, because then when the voter gets that mail piece with like the little devil ears on them, that's like, Amanda for city council, she's the Satan incarnate. It's like, no, I've met her. She's not. She's lovely. Like, I don't agree with her on every issue, but she's not the devil incarnate. And I think that relationship is really powerful.
So how do you replicate that relationship? What are the best methods? Because you're right. What an old friend of mine would describe it as, you've got to try to fill up the cup with who you are before it gets filled up with poison, is the way he would put it. But how do you think about replicating that, about building that relationship?
Best, most important thing any candidate can do is personally knock doors or be present where voters are. So whether that means going to their homes, to their schools, to their community centers, to the gym, to their art center, to their place of work, if appropriate, meeting them face to face. If you can't do that, or if it makes sense given the number of voters that you have, there are other ways to scale that interaction: text messages, phone calls, advertising, and all different platforms. Depending on who your community is and who your voters are, and this is the thing we can help you figure out, it might make sense to do more or less radio, or to do Instagram, or to be on Facebook, or to drop lit across the community so they see your face. To yard signs don't vote, but yard signs definitely remind people of who your name is and that there's an election coming up, and that's not nothing.
We should talk about yard signs. Keep going.
All of this is, again, to replicate that intimacy, or at least get a little bit closer to that intimacy. It's not a replacement for talking to people door to door, and ideally, if you can't do it yourself, you have volunteers who are your advocates as well.
Yard signs. We've never talked about, I don't think we've ever talked about yard signs in the program, but I have thoughts. I even have feelings. All right. You first. Well, do you want to offer your thoughts first, or do you want mine first? Which do you prefer? It's your show.
Yours first, please.
All right. I'm a big fan of yard signs. And I'm not a big fan of yard signs for the reason I think most people would assume. I think that the debate around yard signs, and you already used the quote that has been winning arguments now for a couple of decades, not for 4 decades, but for maybe 2. Okay, which is that yard signs don't vote. So when you're talking to your mail consultant, who by the way makes money when they sell mail, or to your TV consultant, who by the way makes money when you sell TV, to your digital consultant, of course, makes money when you're buying Facebook ads. They say, well, you don't need to, and they're by the way, there's no yard sign consultant and who makes money, like there's a print shop, but there's no yard sign consultant. So they're all like, oh no, you put it on persuasive contact, put it up with stuff that you have, you get to talk to people. Don't do it with yard signs, because yard signs don't vote. By the way, a TV ad doesn't vote either. Neither does a digital ad, neither does a radio ad, right? Neither is none of this. And it is true that just name recognition, just having your name on somebody's yard, how much does that impact? It's a good question. I'll tell you why I like it. I like it for 2 reasons. Less the name familiarity, for 2 reasons. One, because it's some indicator that there is somebody on that block that likes you. It's like a little endorsement for a neighborhood where neighbors know one another, right? It's an endorsement that somebody doesn't have to receive a mail piece to get. It's not like I drive by it and see it. It's for the person who walks by it and says, oh, the Petersons, they like that. Well, I should at least think about so-and-so. The bigger reason I like it is because it's something for someone to do to help the campaign. It's something for someone to agree to do, to therefore be on the list, to have done, to feel they're part of it. I would go and ask people to put up a yard sign. I first did it for a friend of mine who's running for mayor of Cincinnati. And I would get people to agree to put a yard sign even before they knew whether they were going to vote for that person. And I knew once they took a yard sign, they were going to vote for that person. Right? Because it was not just because they'd say their name all the time, because eventually they'd say, well, why'd I put a yard sign out there? Probably because I'm going to vote for them. And eventually they were going to. I knew that was a vote every time. And it was just a way to get a version of a commitment and a way to ask something of somebody at the door, other than a too early, hey, are you ready to support me? Are you ready to support this person? I don't know. I just met you. Why are you being so presumptive as to ask me how I'm going to vote? That's up to me. That's my private decision. But I am allowed to be asked, and therefore somebody is allowed to ask, will you take a yard sign? And I like being able to ask that question. And then if you're supposed to fill out your little bubbles on if a person's a strong supporter or not a supporter, somewhere in the middle, somebody takes a yard sign, they're leaning your way, whether they say so or not. That's why I like yard signs.
100% agree with you. I think we get into, especially within operatives, like a mindset of like, yard signs don't vote, like yard signs, like that's not really the best use of someone's time. But it's like, for most people, it's not a question of like yard sign or door knocking, yard sign or making calls. It's yard sign or nothing. Because yard sign or nothing. And if the best we can get someone to do is put a yard sign out on their front lawn or in their apartment window, great. That's better than nothing. So I think everything you said, and we got to work with the reality we're in, not the reality political science research would necessarily like us to be in.
And I will say the right to life movement in the anti-abortion movement in our state, at least, I mean, one of their pieces of power was the yard sign network, right? When somebody would get endorsed, they would go out to their myrmidons and they would go out to their followers and instantly put up a bunch of yard signs for the anti-abortion, anti-choice candidate in that area. And that was part of how they leveraged their power. So, all right, this was not intended to be the yard sign episode, but you brought it up. So I at least wanted to follow up. I want to ask also about geography.
Yes.
Are you everywhere? Are you where Democrats are more likely to win? Do you try to target yourselves in local elections where it might be harder to win so that we shift a little bit of the geographic divide that afflicts our politics? How do you think about geography?
So we are in all 50 states plus DC. We work at scale everywhere. We see where folks are excited about running. And when they come to us, we're excited to help them. We do not write off any community. For us, you never know what could happen. And also the only way you eventually win big is by losing a little bit less each time. And we also have some targeted work we're doing, in particular around our local election administrator work. So we have state directors in, as of like the last 4 months, Texas, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Texas, Wisconsin, and New Hampshire, and likely to add 1 or 2 more states later this year, specifically focused around the local election administrator work. The goal is that after 2024, those state directors will stick around, and we'll probably bring on another 6 or 7 more. We have between our regional directors and our state directors, we have capacity and coverage for everywhere, because that's how you build power,
How do you measure success?
Number of people running, and number of people who express interest. And we're measuring the conversion from between people who express interest in running and people who actually get on the ballot. We also have pretty clear metrics for diversity within those pools. So we're always looking for at least 51% women, 51% people of color, and about 25% LGBTQIA+.
If I'm allowed a plug, I want to put a plug in for suburban and exurban areas. I want to put a plug in for where those congressional elections, where those state representative and state senate elections are very often on a knife's edge, and where you can build people in a position, both the apparatus as well as the personnel and talent to do that. You can reply to my plug, but that's my plug.
No, we work with so many of our candidates are in suburban and sort of exurban, even into rural communities. And we also, of course, work with people in cities. It's like a little bit commensurate with population, but not exactly. I am particularly pumped about some of the races we're working within some of these redder states. So Indianapolis within Indiana, Kansas City within both Kansas and Missouri, Omaha within Nebraska, Oklahoma City within Oklahoma, and a number of other blue cities within red states, because I think that is a very compelling political divide that is only going to grow. And those are folks that need our support, because the democratic infrastructure there is sparse, to say the least.
No, and I appreciate it. And I'm singing from your hymnal, but one of the reasons I appreciate a 50-state strategy is the snowball can get worse, right? Stuff can get worse. And when Florida was on a knife's edge, then there'd be a lot of resources put into Florida. Once it became a redder state, it then gets redder and redder. And it maps to so many things. It mapped to COVID deaths, right? It maps to education results. It matters not only for the pursuit of power, but once a place enters the network propaganda, once a place is dominated by sort of a Fox News culture, that you can actually map Fox News viewership with a bunch of stuff that people don't want, regardless of their political party. And so making sure that there is no community that is kind of left behind from at least sort of pro-democracy influence feels deeply, deeply important. What about barriers? What are the biggest barriers to people running? Now, our dozens of listeners are not they'll have their own pretty decent guesses, right? They'll know that people will be afraid of raising money. They know that people will be worried about having to set aside their own job, that they'll be their own family. They'll know almost certainly that I think one of the reasons that you do put in extra energy to encourage women and people of color to run is because there are studies that show that, white dudes like me end up sort of feeling like, kind of readily entitled even prior to encouragement, right? And that many other communities who have not had the sort of superstructure of the zeitgeist kind of propelling them or encouraging them into being Prince Charming need to say, hey, that could be you, right? I know we can guess, and our community, our democracy nerd community has pretty good sense of some of the answers, but what do you find end up being either among those most important or something surprising that people might not consider as being a barrier to running for something?
Well, I think to the point we talked about a little bit earlier, a lot of these offices are underpaid or not paid at all. They require a full-time commitment for people who also need full-time jobs. Many of them do not have like childcare baked into it. So that in itself is really hard, especially for younger folks with younger kids. There's the gatekeepers who tend not to think that young people, young women, people of color, LGBTQIA candidates are risky bets, that they can't win, so we don't invest in them early, and then they don't win, and then we're proven true. It's one of the things Run for Something's really intentional about. We do not believe that we know what a good candidate looks like. We know what makes up a good candidate, but a good candidate can have purple hair and a ton of tattoos and have a quote unquote fraught background, and that might be what those voters want. And if that person is willing to do the work to make the case, we should have their back and give them the skills they need to do it. Certainly there's wealth issues here that come into play that intersect with race and class and gender and education level. All of this can keep people out. And I think honestly, for a lot of people, politics seems slimy. It seems like a thing that they don't want to get involved in because they don't think it makes a difference. And for starters, my co-founder and I often say we never want to convince anyone to run for office. What we want to do is open the door to them. And then if they want to walk through it, give them every possible tool they need to be successful. But you never want to push someone into this because it is not for everyone. Everyone should think about it, and it's not for everyone. And that's
So
okay.
how do you do that? How do you make sure that people feel, where is the line, or how do you navigate somebody feeling encouraged and supported and not pushed? I actually am interested in that as a fundraiser. I'm interested in that as somebody trying to become a better, colleague and leader and manager. I'm also interested in that for purposes of this discussion.
Yeah. I think we try to be really honest with people about what they're getting into. I personally, both as like a manager and as a leader, think one of the biggest frustrations that people have is the disconnect between expectations and reality. So how can we make sure there are as much as possible, no surprises, that they know what they're getting themselves into, that they know what success will look like or feel like for them in this race, in this context, and that they feel supported. They're not alone. So we tell people this sucks. Like running for office blows. That doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. It is incredible. And it is going to be mostly terrible. Full stop. Winning, if you do it, will be amazing. And the opportunity you have to make a difference in the place that you call home is unparalleled. But the process of getting there is going to be mostly miserable. So you should make sure you're in this for the right reasons. We also want to make sure that people know there are things about it that are going to be hard, and they will be hard because they are hard. Full stop. There is nothing we can do to make the act of knocking doors every day any less like physically and emotionally exhausting. And we can give you tools to make it a little more efficient. We can give you tactics that people have like experienced to make sure that the doors are knocking on the right ones, and the framework for those conversations, the materials that we have given, all of those are things we can do to make it a little bit more effective. But hard things are hard, as startup folks say, and running for office is one of them. We're going to try and do what we can to connect you to other people so you're not as lonely. We're going to connect you to other candidates in particular in the same life circumstance, because 60% of candidates have told us that their relationship with someone else running for office was their greatest source of resiliency. And to make sure people know that they're going to get attacked, they're going to get harassed, and it's not going to be about them. Especially for people who don't meet the conventional understanding of what a politician is. You are a totem or a symbol for change, for progress, for something new. And people are, especially for young people of color, young women, people's sexism and bigotry is like just looking for an arrow, for a target, and you will be that focus. It can be really hard to not take that personally. So we really encourage people, make sure that your partners are or family or your friends are behind you. Make sure that your mental health is ready for that, because it's going to be rough.
And you mentioned earlier, even if somebody has something in their background they're not proud of or something, whether they have tattoos or not, right? And what's your advice there, right? Because for so many people, and some could be, well, maybe it's not worth it. Maybe it's not worth running, or maybe maybe it means you shouldn't. But how do you help people sort of think through that, navigate things navigate things in their own life they're not proud of which I have them and other people have them too, probably.
Anything that's in your past could be on the front page of your local paper. Are you prepared for that?
Yeah.
Make sure that your friends and family are prepared for that. And this is why we really encourage people, like, tell us what we're going to find in this background check, because if we can find it, your opponent's going to find it. So you should be honest with us, and you should be honest with voters and with your volunteers and with your donors about what they are investing their time and resources in. There is a lot that the American voter will forgive, as we have learned. They really don't like being lied to. So how can you avoid that?
What are some of the others? So we've talked about background a little bit. We didn't talk about the fundraising that much. You said people get nervous, how much are they like knocking on doors? How do you get people ready to raise a bunch of money to run?
Well, we try to, appropriately calibrate expectations. 75% of school board races cost $1,000 or less, 85% cost $5,000 or less. It is really important to keep in mind that for most people, you're not self-funding your campaign, so you don't need to be able to self-fund your campaign. Most budgets that Run for Something works with are under 50,000. A vast majority are under 10,000. And when you fundraise, you're going to have to ask people for money, and it's going to be uncomfortable until you get better at it or used to it. You're going to hear no more than you hear yes. People's relationship with their money and the relationship with politics and the relationship between the two is very complicated, and it's not going to be about you when you hear no. Even when they say this is specifically about you, I don't like you, I don't want to give you money, it's like not really about you. And you will be amazed at who says yes. People will step up and surprise you. They'll be willing to invest in you. The other thing that we like to remind folks when they're doing fundraising is that you're not asking someone for like a loan for lunch. You're not asking them to like buy you a pizza. You're asking them to invest in your shared vision for the place they live and for their home community. It is so much bigger than just you. So I often phrase like fundraising as a public service, because think about what you did over the last 6 years when things felt really scary or dangerous, or like you saw a problem, you wanted to solve it. You threw money, if you had the privilege of doing so or the luxury of doing so, whether it was $1 or $5 or so much more, to the ACLU or Planned Parenthood or Black Lives Matter or whatever the organization or candidate that was that either felt like a solution to a problem. Running for local office gives people a place to channel their energy and their resources, whether it's financial or otherwise.
So I'm thinking about, and this again, just to sort of praise your work, I just need to do a little bit of arithmetic, which I should have been able to do in my head. But if you're working on races that are $50,000 a piece, let's put that in context of the presidential elections. The presidential election was $4 billion in 2020, right? It'll be more in 2024. For $4 billion, you could afford 80,000 races. You'd afford 80,000 races at $50,000 a pop. And therefore, if people are looking for where they want to make highly leveraged investments of their time or their treasure, that helping county clerk candidates around the country at 50 grand a pop, like don't have to do 80,000 of them to have an enormous historic impact.
That's exactly right. We calculated it out at one point. We spent on average, or Run for Some candidates on average spent about $10,000 per winning race.
You spent how much? Say that again.
About 10 to 11 grand on a winning race.
Yeah. So you talked about that voters can overcome a bunch, but have a hard time overcoming with feeling like they can't trust the person that they've been lied to. How do you help? It can be scary, right? I mean, particularly if a camera's right in front of your face, or if a microphone's right in front of your face, or if you're right in front of if you're in front of a house party when you're trying to ask them for money or volunteers, or when you're in a forum and you're trying to ask for an endorsement or for just votes in the room, that if somebody asks a hard question, it can be very hard to find the courage as well as the words, even to discern exactly what not only the best thing to say, but the correct thing to say. It can be a tangled web. It can be hard. How do you help people get ready? I will say, I think part of the answer is just starting out with the basics, that as you do that, I think probably helps, right? Is it, well, this is why I'm doing it. This is what I could do. But how do you help people get ready to, and maybe it's just always select people who never lie. I don't think that person exists in the world, right? So yeah, how do you help people with that?
Yeah, a big part of it is giving people permission to say, I don't know. Creating space for them to say, I don't know, but I'm going to find out. Showing examples of folks who have done that and have not been punished for it. But so much of this is about making sure that the candidates we work with are confident in who they are and what they believe and the places they have to grow. I would say some of one of the best ingredients for a good candidate is a good therapist. They really have to know who you are. It's said that a presidential campaign is like an MRI for the soul. I think it was Axelrod who said that. The same is true for a school board race or a state legislative race. It's going to force you to really dig around internally and understand your boundaries, your sense of self, your value system, and how that shows up in practice, and also how it changes over time. That's part of what makes it such a worthwhile experience.
You have thoughts about debates?
Mostly they don't matter.
Say more.
Mostly they don't matter. The best thing you can do going into a debate is do no harm. You don't want to Like the only thing that if somebody is paying attention to a debate, they probably, especially on a local level, they probably already know who they're going to vote for. They're probably already engaged. So the best thing you can do is do no harm. That's not to say you shouldn't prepare and practice, but we tend to overinflate them. They are an earned media opportunity. Think about the message. Think about what the headline you want out of it to be before you go in. Keep coming back to that home base, but don't overstress it, because you can get into your head about this and it'll send you a flying, and often overly prepping for it is not as good use of your time as like knocking doors.
Got it. So the fact that people inflated, or your view that people overinflated in their minds, how operationally that matters is don't spend days and days and days and days in prep, spend hours in prep, maybe a little more than that if you're running for president of the United States.
President is a whole different thing, but like even those, do they really, like, I don't know, did Trump ever win a presidential debate?
Yeah.
No.
If you ask his supporters, he won every single one.
Right. If they're already paying attention, they
And to his
probably,
opponents, he lost every single one.
yeah. So it's part of playing into a larger narrative, but a debate will not make or break a campaign for the most part.
So then how do you use the debate experience, right? How do you use that opportunity? How do you maximize it without maximizing time and resource, without overinflating it? What function can you feel that it serves, or do you feel that it can serve?
Well, I think the act of preparing for a debate is helping you refine how to communicate what you want to say in as concise a way as possible. But also the best way to do that is by talking to voters, by talking to reporters. It shouldn't be the first or the last time that you're engaging with the press, or even with your opponent. And it's a chance to really culminate the brand that you've been building as a candidate. So how does someone feel when they engage with you, when they see you on the TV or like in the newspaper? It's about that. It's not really about the exact words you say or even what point you're trying to make.
So we've talked about yard signs, we've talked about knocking on doors, we've talked about fundraising, we've talked about debates. An element of, and that conversation, much of the reality of that conversation we could have had 25 years ago. We could have 50 years ago. And that's encouraging it in part because there's some truths that aren't new under the sun, right? That they're just kind of how things are, that relationships, and I thought you said so cogently, right? You're having that relationship with the voters is the most important thing. And whether that's because you've been able to build it personally, or because you've been able to do it through a friend and neighbor helping you, or you did it through some sort of campaign communication, that's always been, roughly, always strong word, but kind of always been true.
That's right.
Something that is newish, less new now, but still newish, is social media. You've served as a digital strategist. And I remember when we were doing campaign stuff, and still the vast bulk of campaign budgets were spent on TV ads, right? And there'd be those who say, well, not as many people are watching TV anymore. And so, and then there'd be a big back and forth about that, right? And I genuinely think that a big part of that back and forth was that the billing apparatus was set up for mail and TV ads. The billing apparatus was not as well set up around digital strategy, right? There weren't as many digital strategists, weren't exactly sure how to quantify and how to value them, what portion of your budget should be put there. And if you went to your major funders and to your endorsers and said, and they looked at your campaign plan and you had a significantly outsized portion of your budget on digital media, they'd say, what are you doing here? That seems weird, right? Where if your budget looked kind of similar to the most recent successful candidates they'd seen, they'd say, okay, well, that looks like you know what you're doing, and they'd move on to the next question. How do you think now about digital strategy, about the investment that people should be making into that? Any tips on what people should be doing or not doing?
Every platform has a slightly different audience, so be really intentional about making sure that you're reaching the right audience. Especially for most of the candidates run for something works with have maybe one staffer. Like, where is you as a candidate's time best spent? It might be Facebook, it might be Instagram, it might be Twitter, it might be something else entirely. It might be Snapchat, it might be Real. I don't know, maybe the social media network for knitters. There's a whole bunch of different ways as you think about as a candidate where you're spending your time, which is one of your most scarce resources. But being intentional about where your voters are, and then being yourself on that platform. Especially for folks who are not as comfortable on the internet, don't try and push it. Like the best candidates we've worked with are the ones who can use the internet comfortably and and can be themselves, or at least a portion of themselves online. That's really important. And if you have money, and the internet can be a really valuable place for advertising. But again, being really the perk, one of the many perks of digital advertising is you can be really targeted. So being thoughtful about where you're doing your ads.
Most frequent mistakes. What are three most common mistakes that you see campaigns or candidates making?
Oh, three most common mistakes.
10 is acceptable. One is also doable.
I think thinking that there is like a that was easy button, expecting the party or the institution that they're engaging with to have the magic donor list. Doesn't exist. And it's not even laziness so much as like a hesitation to do the work, or thinking that like I don't have to knock doors, I can just tweet. I don't have to knock doors, I can just, insert whatever tactic you want there is. There's no shortcut. You just got to do the work.
What skill ends up being most valuable that cuts across the largest number of your successful candidates? Skill or trait?
Strong sense of self. Knowing who you are, what you believe, why you believe it, and your reason for getting involved. That's the heart of a campaign. Everything else is how to communicate it.
Getting out the vote.
Hmm.
I believe every listener would know what the typical moniker for that is. GOTV. I'm going to say getting out the vote. What are your favorite get out the vote do's or don'ts?
Make sure you know the rules, so you're not giving people intentionally or unintentionally bad information. You are always in get out the vote mode. This is kind of a hot take, but you are always in get out the vote mode. Most people historically have understood GOTV as the like final weekend before election day, but so many people vote by mail now. So many people have early vote now. It probably starts much, much earlier than you think and lasts for much longer. So you are always in the mode of making sure people know when and how to cast their ballot. You're always doing mobilization, and you're also always doing persuasion. So don't feel like this is just like a specific period of time. It is always time.
I want to get back to you. So I am sure you've been asked, and I was even thinking about avoiding the question. So I'm going to, because I worry it's banal or over asked. So I'm going to try to ask it a little differently. I'm sure you've been asked a bunch of times, what about you? If you're telling people to run for something, what about you? And I want to load that question up a little bit. And then because I want to ask a different question. I want to seek a different question. That I can imagine the best reason, and as somebody who worked first on being a movement builder and then ran for office, that ultimately would probably, I have to say, probably ego and ambition had as much to do with me, and I will say equal to ego and ambition were anger at the current state of affairs, right, and justified or otherwise sense that I could do something about it. But the reasons I thought of as a movement builder, the for and against reasons, I'll explain what I was thinking about then. Because I too, when you say this has become your life, that is not anybody else had any doubt about the truth of that. I have absolutely no doubt about the truth of that. I know what it takes. I have some sense of what it takes to build an organization at scale, and the kind of commitment, and that means the kind of internal commitment that it takes, particularly when there is not a ready billionaire ready to pay for everything for you.
Yeah.
So a strong reason to do it and a strong reason to not do it. And then we can dodge the question or say anything we want. A strong reason to do it, when I thought about it myself, was, well, I'm telling everybody about this stuff. Do I really know? Right. That should I get in, and because we were doing a training program, and if I'm going to be training people, should I go for my own research? Right? Should I go so I understand what it's like? So I'm an embedded journalist, right? I now understand what it takes for a bill to become a law in a much deeper way, because I served in the legislature, right? I know it differently now, and I can teach it differently now. So that was one. The reason not to, and it is my guess, well, uh, the reason not to is that what I would argue is the work you're doing now is like generating 800 candidates is vastly more valuable than you being one.
Mhm.
That's no knock on you. In fact, it's kind of the opposite. That the anti-democracy apparatus has had a bigger impact than any one anti-democracy candidate. That Donald Trump didn't start the fire. He was able to wrangle it. He was able to channel it or at least be fueled by it. And that's how I'd be thinking about it, as a sort of a movement builder first. But how do you think about it?
So I think about this as I go back to the primary questions we ask every candidate. What's the problem you want to solve, the office you want to run for that give you a place to solve it, and why would voters want you to win? And I start with that first question, what's the problem I want to solve? Like this is the problem I want to solve. I want to solve the problem of democracy. I want to solve the Democratic Party. I want to solve the paucity of exciting candidates that I wanted to work with when I was an operative in 2015 and 2016. I want to solve the problem, run for something is solving. Full stop. And there's no office I could run for that would give me a place to solve it. Now, that is not to say that maybe, I don't know, 20 years down the road, I'm not like, oh, I want to solve New York City public schools. Maybe. Right now, this is the problem I care about solving. And I cannot imagine any other way to spend my time.
It's a brilliant answer. What is what is something that people fail to ask you that they should? What are topics that you don't have a chance to get into that you think you ought to be getting into?
Well, people ask me all kinds of shit. Oh, it's a really good question. I mean, I could talk at length about my sort of the way that we've structured Run for Something as an employer, which I think is a really interesting and unique space within the political ecosystem. I'm just back from maternity leave, so I'm thinking a lot about my work as like a new working mom. But mostly I think the piece that I'm most excited about, and that I am really hopeful that more people take away from at least this conversation or writ large, the work we are doing, is that it can't end. And it can't end even if I decide that I want to do something else one day. It can't end even if, Biden wins a second term and Democrats take over Congress. Like, it's not about any of that. It is about such a longer vision for what this country could be, for what a politician could be, for what leadership looks like, for the ways that we build sustainable power. And, especially on some of the issues that at least I care about most, on things like reproductive rights, on things like voting access, it's not enough to win the White House or even to win Congress. This isn't. So,
well, let's talk about the structure of your organization, right? And I will again, one of the benefits I think of a rise of matriarchy is that it can change some habits in our and rather than poking the finger at anybody else, I poke the finger at myself. Like, my own thinking was, and there's still vestiges of it for sure, was that I felt more in service if I was sacrificing, and it felt like more of an authentic interaction with a donor if I too was sacrificing, and therefore that trickled across, right? That meant that somebody was working with us, well, they would sacrifice too. What I failed to recognize in sort of acknowledging my own privilege was, I had sort of family apparatus that helped make that possible. I don't mean that I had $1 jillion, but at least I had a couch to sleep on. In fact, it was better than a couch. I could sleep in somebody's bedroom, right? It meant that when I had gone to a fancy schools, when I was walking out, I didn't have to justify, sort of what I was doing to somebody else, right? That a sense of noblesse oblige, felt like I was scratching an itch rather than causing one. And so I've been very late to the party in this. And so I come as a student with hopefully some measure of humility. How are you structured? And then pile on top of that, campaign culture, right? You said one of the most precious commodities in a campaign is time. I would amplify that, and I'd say it's I'll at least cite a former legislative candidate for Attorney General in our state who said it was the single most, said pretty much everything you need in a campaign, you can get. Right. If
Mhm.
you need some more money, you can probably go get it. If you need some endorsement, you can probably go get it. If you need to write some stuff, you need to knock on some doors, you can probably go get that. But you can never get more is days in the campaign, is hours in the campaign. And so campaign culture, as you well know, is not a 4 day a week, it's not 4 10-hour days, right? It's not a 40-hour week culture. Campaign culture is all the time unless you say, I need a break, right? And so how do you navigate that? How do you structure the organization that both feels authentic to the urgency and I will say some of my own rhetorical architecture was, listen, investment bankers work 100-hour weeks. If we're going to save democracy, we can't think we're going to do it with 40-hour weeks, right? Like we're going to need monks for democracy. I mean, I had a whole, sort of superstructure built up around this. And at the same time, I see the power and the power of setting an example of the kind of world we actually want to live in, which isn't as toxic, which doesn't grind people down as much, which somebody can do for more than 8 months on a campaign, but they could actually do it for 8 years as part of their life and like live a life. But not so going beyond the why, but the how. How are you structuring it to make the organization authentic to sort of campaign realities and at the same time authentic to people's lives?
Such a good question. So Run for Something operates on a 4-day work week. We work Mondays through Thursdays. Fridays are weekends. People want to work or can, but there's no pressure to. We have tried to staff ourselves in such a way that, our work is urgent, but not every task is urgent. We want people to have, I don't call it work-life balance, but like work-rest balance, because work is your life. You work, most of the time that you're awake. So how are you incorporating rest? And we want to really build a culture. We're fully remote, where people can be in charge of their own schedules for the most part. There's like some need for unified hours for meetings, and especially for folks that work with candidates or funders or partners, you feel a little bit flexible, but generally speaking, at least internally, this is a place where you can be a full person. And I will say, like, I mentioned I'm a new mom. For me, my work has never been more important in the macro level. Like what we are doing to build a country for my daughter it like keeps me up at night, and it has also never been less important on a day-to-day level. Like the most important thing I'm going to do today is not, no offense, is not this podcast. It is not like, it's not the countless meetings I've had basically from 9 a.m. until now. It is picking up my daughter from daycare in a little bit and the time I get to spend with her. That is the most important thing I do. So as I incorporate all of that, and as we've built this organization over the last 6 years, it's HR policies, it's good benefits, it's very good compensation. It's making sure that we have really rigorous recruiting and hiring processes to get the best possible staff, who are reflective of the communities we serve. More than half our staff are people of color, including most of our leadership. It is making sure that we are bringing on people who can, have the emotional maturity and the skills to do this work in a way that is culturally competent and with humility and putting candidates' needs first. It's hard. It's really hard. Nobody's tried to build something like this in the political ecosystem before. You mentioned it yourself, like the candidate or the campaign lifestyle, it sucks. And that's part of the reason why so many people, when they sort of age out of that lifestyle, become consultants, which then the most experienced people are in consultant space and then are a little bit removed from the communities they're working in because now they have a mortgage and they have kids and they're in school and like they can't, pick up their life and move to wherever the candidate is. And that in and of itself affects the way these campaigns are run, which is a long way of saying that the work culture of a campaign directly affects the outcome of it, or at least not, if not directly, has an impact on the outcomes of it. So we've tried really hard to build something a little bit different, and we haven't always gotten it right, but we're trying.
As a woman who presents as white, how do you think about your own leadership? And again, not to point the finger at you, but to point the finger at myself, right? Is that and I will say I don't think so. We figured out the question I haven't been able to get. I don't always ask it because it's kind of a dangerous question, maybe. But like, what is the role for a young, ambitious, liberal white male, right? I'd actually be interested in your answer to the question, but that wasn't the question that first came to mind. But sort of, how do you think about that, right? If the most virtuous thing is to promote leaders of color, right? What is that? How do you think about sort of your own leadership? And that is not me saying, therefore, you should step aside. To be very, very clear, I'm just genuinely curious.
It's something my co-founder, who's also a white dude, we're both straight, think a lot about in terms of how we lead this organization. Part of that isn't through hiring. Part of that is through how we participate in external events and the kinds of organizations and panels and partners that we work with. That's knowing what we don't know. We are both perpetually on a journey of making sure that we are learning as much as we can, stepping back whenever possible, lifting the voices of people who need to be heard, and like being as humble as humanly possible. And also to say, like, we have skills that and privilege that have allowed us to create this organization, and we should use it to do the most good we possibly can.
Helpful. Anything else I didn't ask you? Wish I would have.
No, I think you really covered it all.
Anything you want to plug? Give your website again.
Okay, so if you are listening to this and you're like, okay, I'm inspired, I want to run for office, go to runforwhat.net. You can enter your name, your address, your information, find all the offices available to you. 2, you can go to runforsomething.net. You can find the book, you can find our podcast, you can find materials on how to get on the ballot, you can sign up to volunteer. You can also give us money. Recurring donations go the longest way. They help build the backbone of our budget. They mean the world to me, whether it's $5 or $5 million, if you've got it. And spread the good word. You know someone who should know about us, whether as a funder or a candidate or something else, all entirely. We want to help them.
Well, try to, first of all, sort of pile on to your kind of culture of gratitude. I just want to say thank you. That both for what I get out of this is I get to learn, right? And this is, and it's a hugely valuable for me to learn. And you're brilliant, and your approach to this is brilliant. And I say that not to like with the opposite of a pat on the head. I say that because it's edifying to me. It teaches me as I try to get better. I think it will be useful to other people. And I'm deeply inspired by your work. I think it is among the most important work that needs to happen. And I can't thank you enough for doing it. And I can't thank you enough for joining us in this discussion.
Thank you for having me. This has been a really fun, really in-depth conversation that I really enjoyed having.
Amanda Litman, co-founder, co-director of Run for Something. Thank you, Amanda. Thank you for being a democracy nerd. And everybody, check out runforwhat.com or .org?
.net.
.net. Runforwhat.net. All right. Amanda, thank you so much.
Thank you.